almost missed this. She was hidden in the long grass, invisible to everyone except those who knew precisely what to look for. A lioness, pregnant, alone, laboring against a fate that without intervention would have claimed her and every life she carried before the sun rose again. You almost missed her story entirely, but you didn't. And that matters more than you know. The breath before the storm. There are moments in this world when time itself seems to hold its breath, when the golden grasses of the Savanna stand perfectly still, and even the wind dares not whisper, when the insects cease their endless conversation, and the birds forget momentarily that they have songs to sing. These are the moments between one heartbeat and the next, fragile as spun glass, heavy as stone. And those who are paying attention will tell you that the world, in those instants, feels as though it is waiting for something it cannot yet name. This was one of those moments. The Savanna stretched endlessly in every direction, vast and indifferent and achingly beautiful, the way only truly wild places can be. The acacia trees stood like sentinels against a sky bruised purple and rose by the retreating night, their flat-topped silhouettes as familiar as old friends to those who knew this land. The air smelled of red earth and dry grass and the distant memory of rain. It was the kind of morning that made you understand, without being told, why ancient peoples looked at this landscape and believed it to be the very cradle of the world. She moved through it like a secret, low to the ground, slower than she should have been, her great tawny body betraying the effort of each step with a barely perceptible tremor. Had you blinked, you might have missed her entirely, the way the golden grasses seemed to part for her, then close again in her wake, as though the Savanna itself was keeping her passage private. She had always been like that, powerful enough to command attention, but wise enough to move in the spaces between it. Her name, had anyone thought to give her one, might have been something ancient and proud, something befitting a creature who carried within her not only her own fierce heart, but the fragile, fluttering heartbeats of lives not yet begun. Something in the old Swahili tongue, perhaps, that meant she who endures, or daughter of thunder, or simply queen. Because that is what she was, in every line of her body, in every careful, deliberate step, in the way she held her great head even now, even exhausted, even afraid, i.e. there was royalty, the kind that is earned rather than bestowed. She was a lioness, and she was in trouble. Chapter 2, The Finding. They found her just as the sun dipped behind the acacia trees, painting the sky in shades of amber and warning. The rescue team had been tracking unusual behavior for 2 days. Reports from local rangers of a lioness seen alone, far from any known pride territory, moving erratically through the tall grass near the dried riverbed. In this work, unusual behavior was never a footnote, it was always the headline. And so they had come, as they always came, with their equipment and their expertise and their carefully managed hope. She lay half-concealed in the long grass, her great sides heaving with the effort of every breath, her amber eyes are usually sharp as spears, capable of reading the dark from half a kilometer away, now clouded with exhaustion and something that looked unmistakably like fear. It was the fear that undid them, not the size of her, not the knowledge of what she was capable of, not even the circumstances of her predicament. It was the fear in those ancient golden eyes that reached across every boundary of species and instinct, and reminded every person present that vulnerability in any living thing carries its own particular gravity. The team leader crouched in the grass, binoculars raised, reading the signs with the practiced fluency of a man who had spent a lifetime learning the language of wild animals. The shallow, rapid breathing, the way she shifted her weight, then stopped, then shifted again, unable to find a position that eased whatever was bearing down on her from within. The absence of her pride. A lioness this close to her time should never be alone. That she was told its own bleak story, one written in the gaps rather than the words. Something had gone wrong, perhaps long before today. She hasn't got long, said the team leader quietly, his voice low enough that only the wind might hear. He had seen many things in 30 years of wildlife work. He had held animals that did not make it, and animals that defied every prediction to survive. He had learned, in those 3 decades, not to promise outcomes he could not guarantee, not to let sentiment override science, and not, under any circumstances, to look away from what needed to be done, simply because it was hard. He had learned all of those things, and still, this settled differently in the chest, because she was magnificent, because she should not have been here alone, because the lives inside her had not yet had the chance to be anything at all. The team exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that form between people who have worked together long enough that language has become almost redundant. They understood one another completely. There was no debate, no hesitation, only the quiet, collective squaring of shoulders that means we are going in. Chapter 3. The Hands of Giants. Every second mattered now. Every movement had to be measured, deliberate, sure, each action choreographed to minimize stress for the animal, maximize efficiency for the team, and leave absolutely nothing to chance. There is a particular kind of pressure that descends on wildlife rescue work that has no equivalent in ordinary life. It is not the pressure of a deadline or a quarterly report. It is the pressure of irreversibility, of knowing that the margin for error is not thin, it is non-existent, that the next decision made in the next few seconds will matter in ways that cannot be undone. There was no room for hesitation, for second guessing, for the luxury of doubt. The equipment was checked, rechecked, and checked again. Dosages calculated with the precision of a watchmaker, because too little would achieve nothing, and too much was unthinkable. The veterinarian's hands were steady. They always were in the field. The steadiness, she would tell you if you asked, was not the absence of fear. It was fear that had been thoroughly acquainted with purpose, and had agreed to stand aside. The dart found its mark with a soft, barely audible hiss, a sound almost too small, too gentle for the weight of what it carried. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The lioness lifted her head, those amber eyes suddenly sharp again, scanning for the source of the disturbance with an instinct that had been honed across 10,000 generations of survival. She was alert. She was present. She was, in that moment, every inch the apex predator she had always been. And then, slowly, like a great ship coming to rest against a quiet harbor, the tension left her body. Her breathing deepened. Her head lowered. Her paws, enormous and scarred from years of the Savanna's particular curriculum, folded beneath her one by one. And slowly, so slowly, the great lioness surrendered to a dreamless sleep. Her enormous paws folding beneath her like a queen finally permitted to rest her crown. There was something almost sacred about that moment, about the stillness that followed the movement, about the way the grass seemed to settle around her, as though making room. The team moved quickly but without urgency. That careful, controlled speed of people who understand that haste and efficiency are not the same thing, and that the difference between the two can cost everything. They gathered around her then, these ordinary humans doing extraordinary things, their gloved hands gentle against her warm, tawny fur. She was heavier than she looked. She always was. Strength, it seemed, had a weight all its own, not just in the physical sense, but in the strange, aching way it feels to touch something so powerful in its moment of helplessness, and to understand that the power has not left, only paused, trusting without knowing it was trusting, that the world would still be there when it returned. Chapter 4. The Miracle with Muddy Paws. And then as if the Savanna itself had been waiting, as if the whole wide world had been leaning in, breath held, on the other side of some invisible threshold, it happened. Not with fanfare, not with the dramatic flourish that the occasion surely deserved. Life in its truest form rarely announces itself with trumpets. It arrives instead in the small, wet, gasping moments that catch you entirely off guard, even when you were expecting them, especially when you were expecting them. The first cub came into the world in the hands of a wildlife veterinarian who had delivered hundreds of animals across 2 decades of field work, and who would later say quietly over a cup of tea that had gone cold while she was talking, that she had never entirely gotten used to it. The moment of arrival. The instant in which something that had not existed, I, not fully, not out here, not in the breathing world, I suddenly, irrevocably did. It was, she said, the closest thing to magic that science had ever allowed her to witness. Not with a roar, not with a thunderclap, but with a small, wet, trembling thing, barely larger than a human fist, who blinked open 2 unfocused eyes and found, for the very first time, that the world existed. There is a particular expression on the face of a newborn animal, i.e., before they have learned to be afraid, before the 1,000 urgent lessons of survival have begun their relentless instruction, that is unlike anything else in nature. It is the expression of pure, unfiltered being, of existence without context, of a creature who is, in that single extraordinary instant, nothing but alive. Then another, then a third. 3 cubs, 3 perfect, impossible miracles, born at the edge of catastrophe, arriving one after another as if they had simply been waiting for a quorum before making their entrance into the world. The team worked around them with a tenderness that the moment seemed to demand, checking, measuring, warming, rapping, their voices low and steady and kind, speaking in the universal language of comfort that requires no translation, not even across the vast distance between species. They were cradled in the hands of the very species that had, too often, been their kind's greatest threat. And were choosing, tonight, to be something else entirely. That choosing mattered. It always does. Not because it erases what came before, but because it insists, with a quiet and stubborn insistence, on what might yet be possible. On what humans, at their very best, are capable of becoming. 3 small lives, breathing in the African night. And the people who had given everything they had to make sure those breaths could happen. Chapter 5. What a mother knows. When the lioness finally opened her eyes again, the world had changed. Not the Savanna that remained as it had always been, ancient and enormous and serenely unconcerned with the small human dramas unfolding at its feet. Not the sky, now brilliant with stars, the Milky Way arching overhead like a reminder that the universe is far older and far larger than any single story within it. But something had shifted, nevertheless. Something in the particular quality of the darkness, in the smell of the air, in the sounds reaching her as consciousness returned, like a tide coming in across a flat and patient shore. She lifted her great head, nostrils flaring, reading the air with senses older than language, older than civilization, older than the very concept of rescue or mercy or the idea that one living thing might choose to help another simply because it could. She was still groggy. The sedation lifted slowly, like morning mist burning off the grass. And for a moment, she was confusion itself. All instinct. And no information. A queen waking in an unfamiliar kingdom. The team held their collective breath. This was always the most uncertain moment. The returning, the recalibration. And then she found them. Her cubs. With her nose, first. That extraordinary instrument capable of reading an entire history from a single thread of scent. And then with her eyes, blinking the last of the sedation away, focusing and refocusing until the small, warm shapes before her resolved into something her every instinct recognized with a recognition that went deeper than thought, deeper than memory, deeper than anything that could be taught or learned or explained. These were hers. She had carried them. She had brought them through. They were here. She let out a sound, then, not quite a roar, not quite a purr, something between the two. Something low and rich and resonant. that seemed to come not just from her chest, but from some older, deeper place entirely. Something that had no name in any human tongue, but which every person present understood completely, as though it had been spoken in the language they had all known before they learned words. The sound moved through the team, like a current. More than one person looked away, briefly, and said nothing, and that was the most eloquent response any of them could have offered. It meant, I have you. I have you. You are mine, and I am yours. And we are still here. She drew her cubs close with one enormous, careful paw, eye gentle as a whisper, steady as a promise, eye, and began to clean the first small face with the rough, patient devotion that only a mother knows. The team stepped back. Their work was done. And the Lioness, already absorbed entirely in the only task that mattered now, did not watch them go. She did not need to. She was already somewhere else. Somewhere ancient and private and absolute, where it was only her and these 3 small heartbeats, and the long, unwritten story waiting ahead of them. Chapter 6, The Choosing. The rescue team stepped back, then further back, until they stood at the edge of the torchlight, and the darkness claimed the rest. They stood there together, eye-tired, grass-stained, some of them trembling slightly from the release of hours of sustained tension. I and they watched, because there are sights in this world that you do not leave until you must, that hold you in place with a force gentler than gravity, but no less insistent. The sight of a lioness with her newborn cubs in the deep dark of the African savanna, alive when she should not have been, breathing when the odds had argued otherwise, is one of those sights. It lodges somewhere behind the sternum and stays there, warm and permanent, for the rest of your life. They would watch from a distance as the lioness gathered her cubs close, as she cleaned each tiny face with the rough, patient devotion that only a mother knows. They would watch as the stars appeared, one by one. Above the savanna, those same stars that had watched over this same landscape for longer than any human institution, any recorded history, any story ever told. They would stand there in the particular silence that follows great effort and great relief, and something that can only be called grace. And they would feel, each in their own way, a strange and specific gratitude of people who have been permitted to be present at something that matters. Because there are stories that remind us what we are capable of, not the worst of ourselves, which is amply documented and requires no further advertisement, but the very best. The parts of human nature that choose difficulty over ease, that turn towards suffering rather than away from it, that arrive uninvited in the dark, with equipment and expertise and the willingness to try. These stories do not make the news as often as they should. They happen in fields and forests and savannas, witnessed by no one but the participants and the stars, and they are no less important for the absence of an audience. Perhaps they are more important, because there are stories that whisper in the gathering dark that compassion is not weakness, that choosing to help when helping is hard, when it costs something, sleep and safety and the comfortable illusion that the suffering of other creatures is not our concern. Is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the largest things. One of the things that separates a species with the capacity for destruction from a species with the capacity for wisdom. We are not always wise, but we can be. And the choosing that is everything. That is, perhaps, the most human thing of all. And tonight, in the wide and ancient dark of the African savanna, 3 small hearts beat on, because someone chose to show up.